The first immigrants to America did not arrive legally, peacefully, or with permission. They crossed an ocean, imposed themselves on a continent, and rewrote it by force. Entire societies were displaced, borders were drawn where none had existed before, and power, not belonging it, decided who would remain. Only later would this be remembered as settlement instead of conquest. From the perspective of those already living there, this was not immigration, it was invasion. But once control was established, history changed its language, and memory followed power. Europe did not simply discover America, it moved into it. From the ports of Western and Southern Europe, ships carried people driven by war, hunger, religion, and rigid social hierarchies. They did not come as Americans in waiting, but as Europeans escaping a world that had little room for them. Long before the United States became a nation of immigrants, it was already being shaped by outsiders, and struggling with what that meant. This tension would never disappear. It would repeat generation after generation, each time with different people, different accents, and the same fear. America was built by immigrants, and has feared them ever since. When the first outsiders arrived in the Americas, they did not come as a single group. They came under flags. Spanish and Portuguese expeditions moved through the Caribbean, Central America, and South America, claiming land through conquest and conversion. British and French settlers followed in North America, establishing colonies that pushed outward, displacing native societies and reshaping the land around European political and economic systems. These were not migrations in the modern sense. They were imperial expansions. Armies, settlers, missionaries, and administrators arrived together, backed by distant crowns and driven by competition for territory, wealth, and influence. Where these powers established control, they imposed their languages, religions, and laws. Spanish and Portuguese rule reorganized entire regions around extraction and hierarchy. British colonies developed systems of land ownership and governance that excluded those already living there. French settlements followed similar patterns, adapting to local conditions while still asserting control. What unified these different empires was not culture, but method. Power decided belonging. As colonies stabilized, conquest slowly disappeared from the story. What had begun through force was reframed as settlement, and the descendants of conquerors stopped being seen as immigrants at all. Their presence became the starting point of national memory, while the displacement that enabled it faded into the background. This shift created a lasting standard. Those whose ancestors arrived backed by empire were seen as foundational. Those who arrived later without power would be judged very differently. Belonging was no longer about arrival. It was about authority inherited over generations. This was the first and most enduring version of the immigrant paradox. Outsiders who arrived through conquest, redefining themselves as natives, and then setting the terms for everyone who followed. By the 19th century, the age of conquest was largely over. Control had already been established. What the growing country needed now was something different. It needed workers. Industrialization, urban expansion, canals, railroads, and factories required vast amounts of cheap labor, and Europe supplied it. This time, the people crossing the Atlantic were not backed by empires or crowns. They arrived without authority, without land, and without power. The Irish were among the first to arrive in large numbers, fleeing famine and economic collapse. They settled in cities like New York and Boston, taking the hardest and lowest paying jobs available. Their poverty made them highly visible, and their Catholic faith made them suspicious in a society that still defined itself as Protestant and British in character. Public reaction was immediate. Irish immigrants were portrayed as violent, disorderly, and incapable of self-rule. Political cartoons depicted them as subhuman, and warnings spread that they would overwhelm American cities and undermine social order. They were needed and deeply resented. As the century continued, Southern Europe followed. Italians and Greeks arrived in growing numbers, drawn by construction work, factories, and ports. Many planned to stay temporarily, sending money home, which only increased suspicion that they were not loyal to their new country. Their neighborhoods were labeled dangerous. Their customs were viewed as backward. Crime was no longer seen as individual behavior, but as a cultural trait. Then came Eastern Europeans, Jews, Poles, Slavs, escaping pogroms, repression, and economic exclusion. They arrived speaking unfamiliar languages, practicing unfamiliar religions, and forming dense urban communities that felt permanent rather than transitional. To many Americans, this wave felt different from those before it. These immigrants were not just workers. They were seen as strangers who would never fully blend in. What made this moment distinct was not the scale of migration alone, but the loss of power. Unlike earlier settlers, these Europeans did not arrive with land to claim or institutions to impose. They entered a society where the rules already existed, and those rules were not written for them. Belonging was no longer assumed. It had to be proven, and often delayed. America depended on their labor to grow, yet feared what their presence meant for its identity. Cities expanded rapidly, accents multiplied, and the familiar social landscape began to change. The reaction followed a now familiar pattern. When numbers increased, tolerance declined. When communities became visible, pressure grew. Eventually, restrictions followed, aimed not at stopping immigration entirely, but at controlling who was allowed to belong. This phase marked a critical transformation. Immigration was no longer about taking land, it was about entering a system built by others. And for the first time, America confronted a tension it could not resolve easily. How to benefit from newcomers without granting them full acceptance. The immigrant paradox deepened. Those who had arrived with power became the standard. Those who arrived with labor became the problem. And that distinction would shape everything that came next. Time accomplished what fear and resistance could not. The children of Irish, Italian, and Eastern European immigrants grew up speaking English without accents, attending American schools, and understanding the unwritten rules of the society their parents had struggled to navigate. They served in wars, voted in elections, and moved gradually out of crowded neighborhoods into more stable lives. Difference softened across generations. Customs adapted, names were shortened, and traditions blended into the broader culture. Foods once viewed as foreign became staples. Religious and cultural practices that had once inspired suspicion slowly became familiar. With this shift came acceptance. But acceptance came at a cost. As immigrant communities integrated, the memory of how they were treated began to fade. Hostility turned into nostalgia. Struggle transformed into success stories. What had once been a source of fear was now remembered as evidence that the system worked. History began to simplify itself. The discrimination, exclusion, and suspicion that defined earlier decades were compressed into a single idea: that previous immigrants had done it the right way. The complexity of their experience was lost, replaced by a cleaner, more comforting narrative. This change in memory reshaped how immigration was understood. Once inside the system, former outsiders began to see themselves as its guardians. Stability created a sense of ownership, and ownership produced boundaries. The very people whose grandparents had been viewed as dangerous now spoke of tradition, order, and national character. This was not a betrayal of history, it was a consequence of it. Belonging, once achieved, became something to defend. As a result, immigration shifted from a lived experience to an abstract concern. The human stories faded, replaced by numbers, categories, and labels. New arrivals were no longer compared to the struggles of the past, but to an idealized version of it. The ladder that had once been climbed quietly disappeared from view. This is how the immigrant paradox completes its cycle. A society built by outsiders gradually forgets that it was ever shaped by them. Each generation redraws the line between us and them, convinced that the present challenge is unprecedented. But history shows otherwise. The fears feel new only because the names and faces have changed. The arguments, the anxieties, and the reactions follow a familiar script, one written long before the current moment.